This is the new Sigma 23mm f1.4 for the Fujifilm mount, a slightly smaller lens than the current offering from Fujifilm, but coming in at a significantly lower price point and only a little bit more expensive than their current f2 version. But is it worth it? Let's check it out. Now, big thanks to Sigma for sending this over for the sake of this review. I definitely have to send it back. I don't get to keep it. They're not paying me. They're not seeing this video before it goes up, anything like that. But I did have access to it before it was officially announced and have been shooting with it for the past couple of weeks. So with that being said, here are my thoughts. First of all, this is on the Fujifilm X-E4, which is a much smaller body than something like the XT series, the X Pro series, stuff like that. Even the XS, 10, XS20, cameras like that are going to be a little bit bigger and be able to, sort of like handle the size of this a little bit more. Not that this thing is big by any means, but it's just one of those things where, just a little bit more front heavy. And especially if you're going to compare it to something like the X100V, obviously you have an f1.4 lens versus an integrated f2 lens. It still makes a fairly big difference there. And I guess because we are on the topic of size, the f2 version from Fujifilm, kind of like the Fuji Crons as they have been called at times, that lens comes in at only 180 grams, so super small and lightweight. This one actually comes in at almost double at 340. That being said, I have owned the 23mm 1.4 from Fujifilm, the OEM model. That one is 375 grams. It's also bigger, feels a lot more bulky, but it does have some features that this lens doesn't have. So let's talk about the actual body and exterior of this lens and its usability. So one of the first things you'll notice about this thing is that there's just not a lot to it. There is a small marking for Sigma. There's a small marking for the 2314 DCDN 52mm filter threads. But there are no buttons, there's no aperture ring, there's nothing like that other than the manual focus little ring here. So very, very minimal, but especially for a camera like the X-E4 that doesn't have a dedicated autofocus mode kind of switch between AF, MF, or AFC, AFS, that kind of stuff. It is a bit of an annoyance because then I have to set another custom button to something like that, because at minimum, I expect lenses to at least just have a manual focus, autofocus switch. This doesn't have that even, so definitely a bit of a bummer there. And while I don't need it necessarily, I do really appreciate when lenses have an actual aperture dial. Even, this little one on the X100V has a tiny little aperture dial on it. There are literally no buttons on this thing, one focus wheel, focus ring, and that is it. That being said, this does have a really nice focus ring here. It's dampened just well enough that it doesn't feel like it's spinning too much. It doesn't have a lot of resistance. And if you are going to use it for something like manual focus, it works pretty well. Now, as far as image quality goes, this thing is fantastic. I did test this out for the Sony E-mount version a little bit ago when it first came out, and found that it actually almost fully covers a full frame sensor as well. So obviously when you're sticking it on a smaller APS-C sensor, you are not going to have a lot of vignetting or anything like that because it has such a large image circle. And that also means that you're kind of cutting into the center of the image circle in that way as well, giving you a larger set that's going to be really, really sharp. The focus fall off on here is great, especially for a APS-C sensor. The bokeh isn't something that I'm worried about at all. It looks great. The sharpness is fantastic as well. Even at 1.4, this thing would be more than reliable in a ton of different instances. So as far as a just great workhorse lens, this thing would definitely fit that bill. So honestly, there's not really much bad to say about this thing. The only things that I really don't like out of it are just its lack of exterior functionality, with like literally no switches, no aperture ring, anything like that. I feel like those things would be a really welcomed addition, especially in the kind of like Fujifilm world, that I feel like people that use Fujifilm cameras like to be a little bit more in tune with the like process of photography in that same way. It's part of the reason why they do such a good job at continuing to make all these different dials and things that are less like button orientated and more just back to that older school mentality. I think that the experience of this lens would just definitely be better if it did have an aperture ring and especially like an AF/MF switch. That would be fantastic. But if that's something that doesn't bother you, and especially if you have a camera that has easier access to more custom buttons and everything like that, then something like this XE4, that thing might not be an issue for you at all. And as far as performance goes and lens quality, this is just kind of like where I always sort of just consider Sigma to be at like that 1B tier. It's not on that lower tier of a lot of more third-party manufacturers. I feel like the stuff that they come out with is really just like a first-party manufacturer style of lens. And I mean, technically they're part of that L-mount alliance. So I guess that warrants the fact that they could be in, like a top tier OEM style of a lens. And that really shows. And it's one of the things that makes me really love that they are introducing products that give you a really good alternative to something like the Fujifilm model that comes out at $900. But you're able to pick this up with very similar quality and very just great performance overall at $550. And that gives you a slight upgrade in price. You're spending $100 more than the F2 model, but you're getting that faster aperture and that quality that you would also be getting out of the original Fujifilm model, but just at a good kind of mid price point. And I think that's where, companies like Sigma making lenses that fit into those ecosystems and those lineups are a great thing. And I will continue to hound companies like Canon to start doing that again, because it's just great for consumers to have options like this in their lens lineup. It makes the ecosystem of that camera system and brand overall just so much more powerful and flexible. So thanks so much for watching. If you want to check out a video I've done on the X100V, you can check that out up here. Check out another video on the Fujifilm XE4, and I will see you on one of those videos.